when the Pershing just isn't big enough. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale American T29 heavy tank. The model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and/or purchase. However, as I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and made some modifications to the model to bring it up to the condition that we have here. In this video, I'm going to be giving this model a thorough in-box kit review, as well as also be going over many of the kit's attributes, as well as areas to watch out for. With all this in mind, there's going to be a ton of info coming right at you. So sit back and enjoy. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this model here is the American T29E1 heavy tank. The T29 series is a very interesting subject matter, specifically in regards to U.S. military history and also U.S. tank development history. The T29 series as a whole was really the perfection of the heavy tank that was developed for the U.S. military. One thing that's also really interesting to point out is that all throughout World War II, all the major powers had and utilize heavy tanks. Most notably, the two most famous and well-known, of course, are the Germans and the Russians. The Germans with the Tiger and the King Tiger, and the Russians with the KV, and then later on the Stalins. However, the US also did the heavy tank thing also, but to not that great of an effect. The US during World War II was always trying to play catch up with their heavy tank design. Originally, when the war first started, the heavy tank was the M6 series, and that vehicle was just a plethora of problems, and realistically, that vehicle was pretty much obsolete by the time it was finished. So much so that the US themselves knew this, and so we kept them stateside, and we just basically used them as test beds to try out new types of transmission designs as well as heavier ordnance. During this time, there were lots of really interesting proposals and prototypes that were produced. However, these were more or less just half-baked ideas and never really were finalized to something that could enter into series production. This, of course, changed with the M26 Pershing, and yes, when the M26 was originally designed and entered into production, it was intended to be utilized as a heavy tank. With its 90mm as well as its thicker armor compared to the M4 Sherman, this was definitely something that was deemed to be adequate with dealing with the Tiger I. Unfortunately with the Pershing was that it wasn't heavy enough, and by the time the vehicle entered into production and began to be fielded by frontline units, at this time here, the Germans already moved on to the King Tiger, and between the two, the M26 Pershing was going to be at a disadvantage compared to the German counterpart. So the designers basically had to go back to the proverbial drawing board. The result of all of this was the T29 series. The T29 is essentially nothing more than a roided up M26 Pershing. The two vehicles have lots of similarities. First, generic outward appearance. The two are very similar to one another, but also with the way they are manufactured, with the use of a mosaic type hull utilizing both road steel as well as also castings in order to get the basic composition of the armor. They both utilize an all cast turret that have similar geometries to them, and also the T29 was going to utilize many off-the-shelf detail and suspension components that were lifted directly from the M26 family. Such things as the suspension, the track, the hatches, things along those lines are basically nothing more than direct units used for the M26 family. And that's really where the similarities end. Outside of that, the T29 series was a mammoth of a vehicle and was going to dwarf the M26 Pershing in basically every which way. In terms of length, width, height, armor protection, and armament, these vehicles are massive. For the vehicle's weight, it came in at 70 tons. Because of this massive weight, duckbill end connectors were utilized on the end tips of the track in order to give the vehicle more surface tension so it could better navigate and float over softer terrain. What's interesting to point out is that the T29 series was the only series with the Pershing style tracks to get the duckbill end connectors. For the vehicle's armament, this too was also very impressive. At this point, just like with the Russians, the US was done dealing with the German shenanigans. So to arm this vehicle, they gave it the 105mm T29E1. For those who are into tanks, that armament should sound familiar because this is literally the exact same armament that's found in the American T28 Super Heavy tank. Only unlike that design where it was in a casemate, this one here, it was in a fully revolving turret. Secondary armament included a single bow 1919A4 in the standard configuration, but in the turret, instead of utilizing the 1919s for a coax, it utilized two Browning M2 HBs in that role. And this is something that's a bit unique, as generally on American tanks from this period and even onward, the coax was generally a 1919. So to up armor it, or I should say up gun it with two, not just one, but two Browning M250s, yeah, this thing definitely packs some firepower. On top of that, literally on top of the tank, it would not be an American tank if it didn't have another Browning for AA use, located on top of the turret in a folding pintle mount. To get this thing rolling, the vehicle was not going to utilize the GAF Ford V8 that was utilized on the Pershing as well as also on the T28. Instead, they were going to roll with a V12 Ford GAC gasoline engine. However, this particular version here, the T29E1, was trialed with utilizing a different V12 from Allison. The vehicle with these engines was able to hit a maximum speed of 22 miles an hour, although not exactly blistering, but for a tank weighing in at 70 tons, that's actually pretty commendable. However, as impressive as all of this information is, the vehicles sadly never got a chance to prove themselves because, as what's typically the case with things like this, the war ended before the vehicles were able to enter into full production as well as also enter into the field. In total, about 8 of these vehicles were built, and many of them were used as test beds for further tinkering and other new type of technologies that were going to be fielded. However, the T29 series is not one that is a complete dead end because this vehicle here basically eventually paved the way to the American M103 heavy tank, which was something that did enter into full production and service, but in the Cold War years. Before we continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1/35 scale US T29E1 heavy tank kit from Hobby Boss. This is a kit that not only I've been eagerly awaiting to finally get to, but it's also a kit I was eagerly awaiting to be made in a plastic kit form since I was about 13 or so. So this model here is definitely one that I am really going to enjoy building. Or at least that's the idea. So the Hobby Boss T29E1 kit was a model not just greatly anticipated by myself when they were announced, but basically they were met with wide open arms from eager builders out there who, like myself, always wanted to add one of these kits to their collection. The T29 is another one of those type of vehicles that for the longest period of time, basically forever, it has been straight up ignored and overlooked by the major plastic manufacturers like Tamiya, Dragon, so on and so forth. And it's not just true for this one, but it's true for all the other vehicles in this lineup. And it goes all the way up to the M103, and you can also throw the T28 Super Heavy tank in there as well, or the T95, depending who you ask. Same tank, same vehicle. Regardless, the T29 E1 kit was one of those vehicles where you had to really want one in order to have one in your collection. To the point where you had two options for a long period of time. One was to either scratch build the thing, and an era before there were even any M26 Pershing kits on the market was problematic. And the other was to acquire one of the resin kits from a company called Commander Models. They were a garage resin outfit and produced a range of vehicles like this one over here, But their models were, one, expensive, two, they had a very limited distribution, being a small-time outfit, and three, it was a full racing kit. And because of that, that turned off the type of interest from most builders out there. As I often mention in these videos, racing kits require a special skill set in their own in order to put together, and a lot of people just are not used to working with that medium, specifically if they're working, or I should say they're primarily used to working with injection plastic molded models. So this was, again, one of those models that was a pipe dream and you were never ever going to have one in your collection. That all changed in the mid-2010s time frame. As I've touched upon in a few other vehicles of models similar to this one over here, this all changed in the mid-2010s time frame because at this time there was this renewed interest in not just post-World War II American vehicles, but also some of the prototype stuff. And this is where we see an explosion of plastic kits with brand new tooling coming out on the market. Some examples would be the M103s from Dragon. Again, yes, that is a bit of a controversial topic, but still nice to actually see them for once in a plastic kit form, for better or for worse. But you also saw several versions of the M48, the T54E1, and even the T28 Super Heavy Tank. So this was the era that this kit here came out in. And it was so cool to see the news that this kit was coming out. And to make matters even better, not just was it this kit that came out, but it's one of those situations where when it rains, it pours, but there were two options available for the same kit for now on the market for as a general release injection molded plastic item. The one was from Hobby Boss and the others were from Takom. Now, I do not currently have the Takom kits in my collection at this time, so I can't really talk too much about the kits with the exception of one or two features that they have, and I'll be circling back to that when I crack the box open. But regardless, it was excellent to have some brand new, all fully injection plastic molded kits of these vehicles on the market as a wide distribution. And these kits have been on the market literally since 2016. Fast forward a little bit, I purchased this kit, I want to say maybe 2-3 years ago, if that. Purchased the model off of eBay, and it's been sitting in the stash ever since. If I go ahead and wipe off the cover here, of the box, so we get a better view of the box art. Yeah, it's a good thing that I'm finally getting to this one. So the model was picked up for about, I want to say $50 to $70 US, anywhere between there, give or take with shipping and all that. And the model was, again, procured off of eBay. These models are still very easily come by and can be found online via eBay, Amazon, I believe AliExpress, or you could hopefully find one in your local hobby shop. Hobby Boss is a company that has some pretty good distribution, and they're basically nothing more than Trumpeter just with a different Halloween mask on. Seriously, Trumpeter's like one of those companies, it's like the Scooby-Doo villain where, oh, let's see who's behind this kit, and you know, it's Trumpeter. So I've done a few other Hobby Boss kits in the past. They can be found on this channel, and the quality on them I found to be very good. The plastic is nicely molded, the detailing on them is going to be pretty good from what I've seen, and they go together fairly well. Hobby Boss themselves are a relatively new addition to the market. I want to say they came out in 2008 or so, so they've been around the market for a little while now, but again, they're nothing more than Trumpeter, and it's Trumpeter tooling and plastic all the way. But Hobby Boss has carved a niche into the industry of producing some very interesting kit releases, and this one here is definitely one of them. It's also noteworthy to point out that in the early 2010s time frame, they tooled up a range of Pershing and Super Pershing kits, and those are really cool examples. I wouldn't mind adding them to my collection as well at some point down the road. Regardless, they probably recycled many of the running gear components or the CAD files in order to produce this model over here for a reason that should be fairly obvious. One other thing I do want to mention is that a year or two after the release of this kit here, Hobby Boss was going to tool up, or I should say they announced the release of the other version of the T29, the version with the turret-mounted rangefinders. However, as far as I know, that kit has never been released, or if it has, it's just basically completely evaporated, and it's just impossible to find any information out there, even pictures or reviews of the models being built. So, as far as I know, I don't think it's ever come to see the light of day. The Takom one has, but again, that's more of a subject for another video for another time. As for this one over here, like I touched on before, I picked it up off of eBay, and it's about time I go ahead and start it, which takes us directly to the graphic design and the box art. So here we have the box art right over here. It's the T29E1 heavy tank at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. We have here the little parking lot where these vehicles would be parked at. I've seen some pictures of APG where we have this like warning colored embankment in the back with some hills and stuff. Again, for this vehicle, this setting is definitely more than appropriate. The illustration is very good. It's painted by the same illustrator that Hobby Boss have been using on several other kits that they've released in the past. Matter of fact, there's the artist's name right over there and his signature. As you can see, it's dated 2016. We have two high-ranking officers checking out this monstrosity over here, and it's kind of funny. This guy here kind of reminds me of David Schwimmer from Band of Brothers, and now I'm pretty sure you're going to be seeing that too every time you see this box art. So outside of that, nothing really fancy going on here. It's not like an action scene. It's just a nice tranquil parking lot scene, if you will. As for the graphic design, it's quite typical for the other kits in the Hobby Boss range. We have the Hobby Boss logo right over there on the upper left-hand portion, and it's in this solid blue stripe banner right across the top where we have the typeface of the vehicle in question with the same exact information written in Mandarin. There goes the width and the length in case anyone out there is curious. I do get people always asking me to measure my models, and honestly guys, it's not information I'm going to be giving. I just don't have time to measure my things with tape measurers to give you on the videos. It's not happening. But here you go. Rest assured, Hobby Boss got you covered. Moving downward, it's obviously 1/35 scale in this little diamond type setup. Hobby Boss has been doing that for a while, and this is a advanced kit for the ages of 14 plus, which means I should be more than capable of putting it together, or at least I think I should. On the side portion over here, it's quite typical for Hobby Boss as well as all the other sister trumpeter companies. Here we have a nice illustration of the vehicle in question. Some quick verbiage right over here, both in English as well as also in Mandarin. And we have some corporate info. What's interesting is that this box here is dated for 2018. The kits were originally released in 2016, but just like what I mentioned on the V100 armored car video, for some reason, Hobby Boss would, I guess, update some graphic design or some information on the box, and because of that, they would retrofit and update the copyright information as well. However, again, the kits are a little bit older than the date that we see here on the tab. On the opposite side, we have some more Tamiya-ish looking like illustrations of the vehicle in question. We have a sample of the decal sheet, and yeah, there's really a lot of markings on this one. That's not, there's only a couple markings here or there. Here we have some corporate info, barcode, as well as some warning info and stuff like that. Side tab right over here. Nice little thumbnail of the illustration. Same type of verbiage. This is kit number, by the way, 84510 for those who are interested. And I just gotta say, the box is actually quite large, specifically for a 1/35 scale model. I mean, you know, it's got some girth to it. So that's all there is to the box art. Let's go ahead and crack this model open. Now, this is a modern, or what I like to refer to them as super kits, so you're probably going to see some nice fittings on the inside. All right, so everything is molded in this light gray plastic. Again, if anyone is used to working with kits from Trumpeter or the other Hobby Boss kits, it's literally the exact same material with the exact same quality, which is a good thing. So the parts are laid out in the box, much along the lines as you see on several other kits that I've done before, again, from Trumpeter, but also from Dragon, where we have a nice little cubby over here built in to hold the larger components, namely the hull and, in this case, the turret. So let's go ahead and start with these. So here we have the hull. Obviously, this is a Pershing-based type vehicle, so we have lots of angles found on the lower hull plate. We have the two escape hatches right there, and we also have lots of suspension swing arm type fittings. Everything is hermetically sealed in these bags here. Opening it up, so we get a good idea on what the actual molded and quality details are. So as you can see, a lot of the detailing is integrally molded in, and the detailing is very good. On the bottom portion here of the swing arm mounts, you can see the mounting fasteners, as well as also the fasteners here for the little cap. Got the right geometry to it, and the same is also true for the geometry found right there on the swing arm mount as well. On the top portion here, we have all of the return roller mounts integrally molded on, so that's less work that the builder has to do. And we also have the nice geometry over here for that inlet for the front idler system. There are several provisions for mounting on the bump stops and the shock absorbers and those other amenities, but obviously those are going to be found on these sprues in the box below. Plastic molding seems to be pretty good, fairly thick. You know, should be for a nice chunky model once done, which is a good thing. You like, you know, that's a sign of quality. And we do have some nice support struts on the inside to give extra strength. On their Pershing kits, they did have a engine compartment detailing. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case with this one over here, but we'll see how that pans out. Some molding information on the bottom. Yeah, all in all, looks to be a good quality piece. This bag over here consists of the upper portion of the turret. Just like what was seen on the Trumpeter Russian B4 howitzer, they wrapped some fragile areas here with a little bit of styrofoam. That's a nice little feature. Protect some of these fragile bits that are molded on. So the remaining tooling on the turret is excellent. We have some nice geometry to it. And the piece has some very nice cast texturing to it as well. On top of the cast section, we also have some nice weld bead detailing that are integrally molded on. This should look very nice and hold paint even better. Some of the critiques I've had in the past on some other kits, namely from Tamiya, is that the cast texturing isn't really molded on. However, you have to be very careful because after the layer of primer, paint, and varnish and all that, it's not too hard to cover everything up with some layers of paint. With kits like this one over here, this is going to take to the paint much better, and even if you have a couple coats on, you're still going to have some very nice aggressive cast texturing that's going to show through, which is, again, a positive. We even have the tarpaulin mounts right here on the front. They seem to do the job just fine for the scale that this model is molded in. Again, same type of quality of thickness of plastic, and I see absolutely nothing over here that's going to indicate any sort of problems. Next runner is the main armament. It is a two-piece assembly, quite customarily seen on basically every other tank kit out there. I'm pretty sure that there are aftermarket sets out there where they have this type of detailing, but in a turned aluminum CNC format. However, for this kit over here, I think I'll be able to use the plastic one and not have any issues. Bodywork is something that I will be addressing as the video goes on, but it's part and parcel for one of these plastic tank builds. And on the very bottom portion over here, we have some water slide decals. They appear to be good quality. You know, they are printed with modern printing machines, and it's your typical blue paper water slide type decals. And we'll see how these pan out towards the end of the build, where I talk about the paint, the weathering, and these should hold up well with the varnish. I've had some pretty good results with these decals in the past, and I'm really not anticipating any different on this one here. First runner is this large runner that we have right here. Let's go ahead and get this one ripped open. To help me open up the bag, all I have here are a pair of scissors, because I really don't want to put too much stress on the parts when I'm opening up the bag, because that could potentially damage parts on the runner, and that's something you actually do want to avoid. So the first thing I'm going to look at, the one thing that immediately jumped out at me, is the lower portion here of the turret pan. The geometry looks to be really good, but interestingly enough, it's all smooth. And what I mean by that is that there is absolutely no cast texturing found on this component over here, which is something that is found on the upper portion. So this is a interesting oversight by Hobby Boss. And this is something that will probably stick out like a sore thumb if you do not have any sort of ability to add cast texturing to these components, which fortunately I do, and I will be showing that and touching upon that as the video goes on. But that is something that definitely stood out to me. Here we have the mantlet right here. This does have some cast texturing on it. I don't know if that came out on camera, but yep, we got some fasteners on this section over here. We got the rotor protective areas, which would be present on the real unit. And, you know, it looks the part just fine. Here we have the internal rotor, where we have the Phillips, or I should say the flathead screws, rendered on. Detailing is very nice, although again a bit smooth. I believe this should be textured on the real unit. I'll double check and make the adjustments accordingly. Here we have the final drives. Very simplistic, but you know, most of these tend to be covered up by the sprockets anyway, but they'll definitely do the job. Some other details on here. We have the side storage lockers. I like the way that they molded the storage bins as a separate component, which gives you the option to either render them open or close, but also this yields for just better detail fidelity. We have the M26 Pershing pattern of front bow hatches. We have the USAV cupola, the air blower, tow hitch mount, 50 cal ammo can. Yeah, just, you know, a lot of nice detailing I see here. We also have some of the suspension components. I have some swing arms right here. The front idler swing arms are there. Got some tools. We got a tripod for the M2, and it has its little canvas section integrally rendered on. The M2 HB is also here on its M23 cradle, and again, the detailing looks very good for what it is. And I don't see a need to replace it with an aftermarket one or anything. We also have here some sections of the bow detailing. We have the siren, headlight cluster, as well as those areas of the upper hull that contain the wells and the hinge mechanism for the bow hatches. Those jumped out right at me. The brush guard here is a little damaged, but I think it's not going to be a problem to go ahead and repair. Yep. Overall, you know, you see basically is what you get. Okay, next runner gives us some side skirt detailing, and this is something I'm actually on the fence about whether or not to install them. Honestly, I hate these side skirts on American tanks. They just look goofy. But this tank, you know, did have them, but I really like the look of the Pershing suspension. But these ones are kind of cool because they're rubber on the real units. So I'm torn. I really am torn on to do it, or maybe I'll get another one and do that one with it, or do it to the TACOM, or problems to be John from ECA. Regardless, the detailing on them is still pretty good. We have some nice flange detailing here with some fasteners that are present. We also have on this sprue the exhaust manifolds, which are a two-piece assembly, so you guessed it, some seam work will be necessary to contend with. We got the telephone box. We have another tow hitch mount. That's pretty interesting. We have the travel lock right there, and we also have the grill work, which is very, very nicely rendered. I like the way it's also rendered as separate components as opposed to being integrally molded into the top deck. Again, I'm not sure if this kit has an engine compartment or anything, but that is some nice detailing regardless. The detailing is very nicely rendered, and we also have some interior slat detailing as well. Here we have some sections of the rear hull where the idler mounts, or sorry, the final drives will be secured to. We also got some taillight details, and these look awesome. Hopefully they come out on camera, but these are very, very nicely rendered. They're definitely going to clean up extremely well and will look great after they're painted and weathered. But, you know, I always touch upon that as the video goes on. The next runner are in duplicates, and we have two of the same parts in each bag. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up one of them. They are duplicates, and both of them are in excellent shape. And anyone can clearly see that these are the road wheels. And like I mentioned before, this company did release a Pershing in 1/35 scale, and these are literally the parts just rinsed, washed, and repeated. Which is a good thing because the kit had some excellent components. So here you can see the road wheels right there. They are the Pershing pattern, of course. Rubber tire. We have the external version and the internal, both the flange and the fastener details are all present, as well as the rubber tire has some nice geometry to it. We have here the bump stops, which obviously you need a lot of those. A lot of little handles, which look to be very fun to remove and deburr. We have some swing arms. Note they have the torsion bar fastener detailing all there. The back portions are detailed as well, where we have the flange mechanism which is bolted to the piece here. And by flange, I'm referring to the component that hooks up to the shock absorber. And there is a plate that would be bolted to the rear portion of the swing arm casting. And that detailing is present. And even you can see that same detailing repeated on this fellow over here. Although I'm not sure if it's supposed to have that slit, that hollowed out section over there. That's something that I didn't see on the Pershings that I've seen in person. But, you know, I never saw the real T29, so I can't really say heads or tails. The interior detailing on the stampings for the roll wheels look really good. That's something that you don't really see every day. That's a nice little touch. The shock absorbers are a multi-part assembly, which means very nice detail fidelity on that. Which is interesting that they went with this route to make the shocks, as they could have just rendered it as a solid component, because this tank does not have a working suspension, or the ability to have a working suspension. Or at least I don't think it does. No, it doesn't. So the fact they gave you that bit of detailing there is pretty interesting. I mean, at least it yields for some nice detail fidelity. You know, that's a plus. Adds a little bit to the complexity, but I think it should be more than doable. And both runners look excellent. Okay, next runner is the upper hull. And this is a long vehicle, which would eventually carry over into the M103 series, but again, I talk about that another day. So here you get to see the upper hull, and it is similar to the Tamiya M26 Pershing in that the side skirts, or I should say, the tin work is integrally molded into the top section, as opposed to the Dragon kit where, if we can recall from both the M46 and the M26A1 video, the lower and the upper hulls were separate like this. However, the tin work were separate sections that get glued on, which really left for some very nice detailing on that kit. And again, that is a kit I have very high regard for. Excellent model. That's a little mini review in this one. It's a good kit. I recommend checking out that video. Regardless, the detailing, even though it is molded in, is still molded in a nice degree, and it does again make for a simpler build compared to leaving these separate. But here you get to see the parts. They look great. So the tin work has all of these rigidity blisters as well as their support struts all integrally molded on. Fasteners are all there. On the engine deck over here, we have some nice filler cap detailing as well as some nice geometry. There is some slight warpage going on over here. This is probably due to the model being in its box, also from shipping and all that, but this is something that looks like can easily be just torqued and straightened up, specifically once everything is glued in place, and the glue sets with the jigging, that should really do a good job with straightening it out. You definitely do not want to hit this with a heat gun or anything like that. This is just some minor torquing and should straighten out during the course of production. But other than that, it looks great. Everything looks to be as it should be. And we do have some cast texturing found right here on the front armor plate, which is, of course, appropriate for this vehicle. Come to think of it, did they do the casting on the bottom? Yeah, they did. They did the casting on this fellow over here. But they did not continue the casting to the side sections, which, by the way, on the Pershing family of vehicles, and this one included, this lower hull here is a mosaic of roll plate and cast sections, and there would be some cast areas found on here. But for what the kit gives you, yeah, it's good enough. Digging down deeper takes us to what is this, a good luck token or something? Oh, that's nice that the vendor gave me that. The vendor, by the way, was located overseas, which is, quite normal how you'll purchase these models. And here goes the last of the tank parts, which is the sprocket. The sprocket is very, very intricately molded. We have also on the same sprue the bin lids. Interestingly enough, though, they went ahead and molded the bin with their handles integrally molded on. That's interesting because some kits, like for instance the Eschi M60A1, these were separate, and on this one here, they're molded in place. So that's and that kit came out 30 years prior to this one here. But that is actually an interesting detail that they went ahead and molded on. Regardless, they still look great and do the job just fine. But it's just a little data point I wanted to bring up. Here we got the spare track rack as well as the US AV oval loader's hatch. We have the track racks right here on the front, which have this comb type look to them. Very unique for this pattern of vehicle. And we have some other fittings like lift hooks and handles and things along those lines. And just like again with the other parts, or also like on the B4, we have some very intricately molded parts that are protected and shielded with this little styrofoam piece. So let's go ahead, cut this little styrofoam, see what exactly is under here. And we got some brush guards as well as some antenna bases. The antenna base comes out at me is a bit weak. I don't know what that's supposed to be. Generally on a vehicle this vintage you would have an MP48. That's the scissor hitting the floor. You'll have either the MP48, the MP37, or even the MP65. And this one here just appears to be an amorphous blob. So that's really one of the weaker points of the kit. Not going to lie, it would be kind of cool if it had a nice MP48. But I'm going to go ahead and look at pictures of the real one to see if, maybe this is an experimental antenna base and, that's what's stuck on here. But yeah, rest assured, I'm going to go ahead and take a second look at that. Regardless, we have here the turnbuckle, which is a super fragile bit of detailing. And I remember having similar type of, hazards on the Dragon M46 for the same reasons. And we also have the American track jack, it's a ratchet. It's a track ratchet right over here. And we also have the brush guard. Brush guard looks to be pretty good. We'll see how it cleans up. If not, I do have replacements that are made out of HD 3D printing. We'll see how this one here fares with the sprue removal. And the very last of the parts are in these bags over here, and they're also molded in a different color plastic. And these, normally on some builds, would be the scourge of the kit. Now it would have a nice little tirade about how the tracks are garbage, but not on these, because this kit over here did the big brain move and gave you tracks that are workable. Yes, this kit supplies you out of the box workable track links. Are we getting this on camera? Workable track links. Stock model. This is how you do things, okay? There's no indie link. This is how you do it. And by the way, I'm just gonna come out and say it. There's a reason why I have this kit right now as opposed to the TACCOM. This kit gives you better tracks, straight up. Workable tracks. The TACCOM gives you individual link and length, and that's why that's going to be a topic for another video where I could rake that kit over the coals on the crappy tracks that kit does give you. But this one here, workables. And by the way, I am going to be filming a separate video to accompany this one, which is just going to be focusing on the assembly of the tracks. This is due to the case, lately I've been doing a lot of track tutorial videos, and it helps a lot of people out there. And one other reason was actually, it's not the reason, but I was going to do it anyway. But one of the individuals on one of my subscribers, he actually wrote in my comment section to build this particular kit and make a video specifically on these tracks because of their workable nature. As he put them, they are very nice. So, I am going to take you up on that, and I'm definitely going to show exactly how I put these things together. So as for the tracks themselves, they are molded in this brown plastic. This is very similar to what we saw on several of the Trumpeter workable track link sets, namely the ones for the T54, T55 I did a little while ago. And also they are similar in color to the AFV Club Pershing and Patent tracks. Calm down, these are not the same tracks. They're definitely, it's not the same material. But it looks like it's just standard injection molded polystyrene, which the AFE Club ones are too, but some people think they're resin, but they don't know what they're talking about. Regardless, the tracks are very nicely detailed, and they are representing the steel chevron version of the Pershing link. But one thing that's interesting is that specifically for the T29 series is that this series, the tank was so heavy that they even gave the thing duckbill end connectors, and these details are integrally found on these sprues. I also like the way they rendered out the track link. One of the banes of the AFV Club links was that they were very frail and fragile because the track pins were connecting the actual links together, much along the lines as do on the real one. This is great, but this lent to the frailness of those tracks and the unpopularity that they do have. There are ways to go around that. I go over that in that video, but this one here, the pieces appear to be much more robust, and also the horns are integrally molded into the track pad itself, which gives it a little bit more strength as you have more material here, and also it should streamline the production quite a bit, so you don't have to fiddle with that little loose tooth floating around. But this is something I'm going to be again going over in more depth in the video dedicated to just the assembly of these tracks here, so stay tuned for that. That video will probably be posted either before or after this one makes its debut on YouTube, depending on my editing schedule. Regardless, you do have 2 bags of these sets over here, and that's fantastic. And yeah, this is definitely going to be a green light on this project. I don't think I'm going to need to acquire any aftermarkets. On the very bottom of the box, we have here the instructions, and also, again, like we've seen on other trumpeter and Hobby Boss kits that I've done already on this channel, we have a nice little color illustration right over here. These are the same illustrations found on the side of the box. And, you know, it's nice and helpful. I mean, there's no camouflage patterns or anything. This vehicle is just in olive drab, but, you know, it's nice that they do give you a nice little illustration. I appreciate it. And here we have the instruction sheet. Anyone who's ever built any of the trumpeter kits in the past, this should look, you know, very, very familiar to you. Part layout, which is funny because of a vehicle this complex is not really that much of a layout in the parts. It's just, I guess, the physical size of them that we do have. And, you know, just follow the instructions and, you know, let the kit take you where it goes. Of course, if there is any misprint or any other type of confusion on the instructions, I'll mention that as the video goes on. But so far, you know, it seems like it should be doing the job just fine. All right. I don't know about you, but I've been waiting to jump on one of these kits now since I was 13 years old. So let's go ahead and make it happen. Jumping forward a little bit, here we have the hull going through its construction. And I just wanted to point out a few things at this point because it's not going to be really accessible once the model's fully built. So the first thing I want to mention is with the rear section here. So the way the hull is designed is that the tooling can be utilized on several different versions of the T29 or the T30 or 34 family, which is a smart bit of kit engineering. And the difference is with the back section. And the back section is a mosaic type assembly, much along the lines as we saw on the Dragon M26 family, basically for the same reasons. And on the kit here, the parts go together very well, so it is very nicely engineered in that regard. But one thing that I do want to point out is the builder does need to pay attention to the way the parts fit together. Not so much there needing to be any hand fitting or anything like that, but just to make sure that everything is squared away when you assemble the parts. If you're just going through the motions and the parts are not properly aligned and inserted correctly, this will cause detrimental effects as the build continues, namely when you get to insertion of the cluster here to the main hull segment, as well as also, most importantly, when it comes time for mounting the top hull section to the hull itself. After the piece is assembled, I went ahead and let the unit fully dry. Once the glues were set, it was a single piece, and then it just plugs directly into the unit here as one sub-assembly. And again, this is where the builder needs to pay attention to the fit. Not so much there needs to be any hand fitting, but with the way the piece plugs in, you can actually stick it in place and not have it be at the proper location. And this again will cause detrimental effects when it comes time for the alignment of the upper hull. When you assemble the component, just get these guys off for the time being. When you're setting these components over here, you want to make sure that the seam lines all perfectly up in these sections right here and right here. With the way these sections are, we have these 2 rails that emerge out and they connect and plug into these 2 little cutouts found here molded into the lower hull. And with the way the unit is, it actually holds it in pretty well. So well, in fact, that you could just be going through the motions and next thing you know, the piece is actually not installed correctly, which again will cause some problems. So when you're installing the part, you may need to just put a little bit of force on it just so that the parts are seated fully, and once they click in place, you'll have the seams line up as they need to, and at that point there, you're ready to add the adhesives. What I did was I just added some thin super glue to the inside portion over here. The glue ran through the various joint lines and it just got absorbed and sucked in very, very well, and then once it sets, it's now a rock solid part. As you can see, or as you noticed before, I had some of these clamps located in these sections, and this was to ensure that these portions over here are lined up, or I should say are adhered to the sidewall section of the insert. The clamps did very short work of this. Once the glue set, the unit's now a single piece. It's also at this time you'll notice that I did not install the final drives. If you follow the instructions, they want you to install the final drive sections when you're building the sub-assembly for the insert. And instead of doing that, I decided to do that after the unit was glued together, just because it can potentially help the fit a bit better, and if I need to do any hand fitting, it's easier to do that at this point as opposed to when the unit is a single cluster and you're manhandling and trying to figure out how it lines up. However, to be fair, I'm not sure if that's going to be necessary or not. This is my first go ahead of doing this, so your results may vary. But for me, this is just the way my experiences are with these things, and you know, I usually like to install the final drives after the hull is fully assembled. But then again, you know, your results may vary. Well, as it turns out, the saying "you always listen to your gut" definitely rings true. Right after I was filming the last take, I went ahead and tried to fit the final drive into the location, and I ran into a blockage. The final drive did not fully seat in because the area here of the hull emerged slightly too much, so some hand fitting was required. This was taken care of with a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit, and I carefully just deleted just a little bit amount of material on this section over here, clearing up the tolerances. Now the part does fit in place, like so. So, looks like I was right when I said the thing the first time. With the way the plastic is, you'll see a slight little bit of material overhang out from the hull segment into the area here where the final drive needs to go. So obviously this needs to be cut away. Also, if you follow the instructions and you pre-assemble everything before installation, you are going to have to make that slight adjustment with the Dremel before the piece can fully seat in properly. Otherwise, you guessed it, your alignment is going to be thrown off. So, word of the wise, you might want to pay attention to that when you're building one of these builds. The other thing I want to mention on the hull at this time is with these prongs that we have here on the side hull. If you'll notice that there are several sections that pop up, and this is to help align the upper to the lower, and so it interlocks in a nice, effortless manner. Well, with the way the kit is designed, you have extra provisions that are emerging from these sections here, and I believe these are just leftover from the mold making process. And the kit does require you to amputate these sections in order to get the pieces to properly align. The instructions does have this mapped out pretty well, but it can get confusing just with the sheer number of them that are found on the top. So one thing that you want to do is to double check by looking at the instructions, but also with checking with the top hull of the model. And what I'm referring to is here we have the upper hull, and if I flip it over, you'll see these notches that are molded into the top section. So to double check, you basically just line the model up, and it's a little tricky to get on camera, but right there you can see how the notches line up with the corresponding locations on the upper. Well, obviously if they don't, they need to go. In order to remove them, they're very easily removed with a pair of clean cut snips, a needle file, and maybe a little sandpaper for good measure. Once the units are removed, the hull is then ready to commence further. And here's the model, which is barely able to be kept in frame at this angle, and at this point here, it is actually ready for painting. Before I go ahead and get it into paint, there are one or two things I do want to mention at this time, because it's better appreciated at this point, of course, as opposed to when the thing is fully completed. So really quick, the first thing I want to mention is with the fit of the parts. The parts on this model fit pretty good, by the most part. There are one or two small little areas that can use a little bit of hand tuning and hand filing in order to get the parts to fit in a more appropriate manner. But you will encounter certain aspects where the piece is not going to really fit in all that well, and if you just brute force it, you're just going to cause some further problems. Some of these locations would include the areas here for the exhaust, how they plug into the model, as well as also with the main barrel itself. Some tweaking was done to both these locations with a needle file, and then once this was taken care of, the unit just went together without any sort of problems. But this is something I did want to mention. This was also the case for a few other components found on this model. Unfortunately, at this time, they are escaping me exactly where this was. Nope, I remember now. It was on the front. That's right. The front track racks, this was definitely the case where the slots that are molded into the hull are slightly more narrower compared to the material found on the units themselves. And if you try to brute force this piece in particular, it's just going to go downhill very quickly. So a couple swipes with a needle file on the stem itself was all that was required in order to get the part to plug in place. A similar type procedure was also necessary for the majority of the hatches on this model. The two front hatches over here did need a little bit of just some polishing with some sandpaper just to get them to fit into place. even when fitted, I noticed on my example here, there was a small little gap. It wasn't anything egregious, but it was just a little gap found in this area where it could actually see into the vehicle. And it was just one of those things where it wasn't really major, but it was one of those things that did bug me. So I just simply plugged it up with a little smear of red putty, and I just blended it in and stippled it so it blends in with the remaining of the cast texturing found on the front portion. With that out of the way, the unit was much more sealed up compared to before. It's also on this section over here, you have to see some other modifications that I want to reference. One is with the brush guards. These are the kit supplied brush guards, and they went on very well. They are actually very robust, and if you have a good pair of clean cut snips and a good needle file and or some sandpaper, that's really all that you need to deburr these pieces off of the sprue and get them polished up. They're much more robust compared to, say, the Dragon M46 Patent or M26 Pershing periscope guards that I noticed on a few builds in the past. But these ones here, they do polish up very well. And they also plug onto the periscopes much along the lines of my 1/6 scale ones. So that's kind of interesting. But one thing I do want to reference, though, is that the holes that are found on the periscope plates are slightly smaller compared to the pegs found on the molded plastic parts. And again, you are going to have to do some hand fitting here. If you just try to brute force this component in place, it's just going to be obliterated and you're going to crush it, and it's not going to be a good time. To prevent this from happening, a pin vise with a small Dremel bit was utilized in order to just widen the hole just slightly compared to the way it was, and then that allowed the tolerances clearance enough for the parts to just drop in place, and it was a very smooth install. Also at this time here, you get to see the addition of 2 lengths of wire. These are torsion bars on the M26 family, and this carried over into the 46 and also onto these heavy tanks over here. The hatch had a external torsion bar fitted in place, and the torsion bar mounts and other amenities are present, but the bar itself just isn't. It's a bit of an oversight on the kit. Fortunately, it's not really hard to fabricate. Just a little length of thin floor wire was really all that was required. Cut to the shape, glue it into the channel, and you're good to go. Also at this time here, you get to see on the siren, I went ahead and also added the power cable right over there, which is a very thin, or even a thinner piece of floor wire compared to the ones I just mentioned. And a little holes drilled in the back of the siren, little holes drilled right there on the side portion of the MG mount, and that's where the cable would enter on the real vehicle. Other thing to mention at this time are the little grab handles that are found on the side. This is probably one of the most tedious aspects of the build outside of the suspension. And the handles are all kit supplied, and in the kit's wisdom, and this is a really, plus side on the kit, they give you plenty of spares. The pieces are very fiddly molded, and they are the type of things that can easily break upon deburring, as well as also fling off to lost party. And on this model over here, safe to say, I only had that happen to one of the handles during assembly, fling out of my tweezer to parts unknown. But fortunately, there are plenty supplied with the kit. Not, an egregious amount, so you don't want to, just be, busting them willy-nilly, but you do have several spares, which is fantastic. The parts do deburr very nicely if you use a pair of clean-cut snips. And then the mounting locations are very finely molded onto both the fender as well as the bin itself, but they are there, and if you just pay attention, you should be able to line the parts up. Of course, a very fine point plier or tweezer is going to be a must for this. You are definitely not going to be able to use your hand, so something like this is what I used actually on this build over here, and it did the job perfectly fine. One tip I do want to recommend when you're doing very frail bits of equipment like this is you deburr them with the clean cut snips, and you then go ahead and glue them onto place. Of course, I utilize my super glue for this. Once the glue sets, I actually go over with another coat of thin super glue, and this is applied with a piece of wire, and I basically do like the ninja poisoning technique where I'd have a small little bead of glue on the wire and I just drip it into this location over here. The thin super glue just spreads like water, or just goes around the component very, very fluidly. I mean, the stuff is literally like, it has the consistency of water. And then once it dries very, very flat, which is fantastic. So once it dries, it gives you a nice, stronger bond on the part, and it doesn't leave for any clunky glue marks, which on something like this can kill you. Then what I do is, once everything is thoroughly dry, with some 320 grit sandpaper, I just basically lightly just go over the top sections. Literally just like this, where it's barely making contact with the with the handles. This has the effect of lightly sanding and polishing the top portions, and it deburrs any sort of burr that's left remaining on the component from the clipping process. So that is something I definitely wanted to mention at this time. Once the handles are glued in place, it definitely gives the side of the model just so much extra detailing. Same thing is also going to be true for this side here. And this side there is more detailing with the external Pioneer tools, but we'll be circling back on that after the model's painted. Moving rearward to the exhaust manifolds, nothing really much to talk about here. Two-part assembly, glued together, bodywork was completed, and then the pieces were primed in flat black over here, just to make sure that the unit, one, is thoroughly painted, because you can easily miss areas if the pieces are not pre-primed. But the other real reason is just to make sure and verify that the seams have been thoroughly removed. The last thing you want to do is to have a certain surprise pop up when you're heading off into paint. And the same is obviously true for the main armaments as well. So moving on to the turret now, brings us to basically the big reason why I wanted to mention it at this time, and here you get to really appreciate the cast texturing techniques that were applied during the assembly. So as I showed earlier in the unboxing portion, the top half has some excellent cast texturing and well-bead detailing that is present. However, the bottom section is completely and utterly smooth, and this is a ding on the kit. However, it's not one that is a permanent one. It could easily be fixed, as I did over here. You can see that the texturing was added with my usual red putty technique. I have a link to this technique in the video description below, and it'll take you directly to a video where I was applying it to a 1/35 scale model, so you get, you know, an idea on how it's done and the materials that are used. The texturing was done after the upper and lower hull halves were assembled. Once that was done, I then continued with the putty technique, and as you can see, it just blends in with the molded one pretty well. The fit on these parts were pretty good. I didn't really notice anything there. The mantlet section where it plugs into the model did need a little bit of hand fitting, just like I mentioned before with the track racks on the front, but again, nothing that's overly egregious. On the mantlet itself, it needs to be assembled as a sub-assembly unit. With the way the trunnion section is, you have the mantlet that slips in place under these very two finely molded pieces of plastic that get glued on each side on the mantlet, and it locks it in place. This is important because you have these pieces are very small, they're very easily lost. Fortunately, the kit gives you 4 of them with the way the runners are laid out, so that's fantastic. Came in handy on this one. And you also want to make sure you use a finite amount of glue, where it's just enough amount of glue to hold the piece in place, but not too much where it glues it solid. And with these tight confines over here, it's definitely one that you have to pay attention to. You'll also see that the unit has also been pre-painted and primed at this time. Again, obviously trying to get paint into this area over here once it's fully assembled, it's not exactly going to be a very easy endeavor, so it's best to do that before the thing heads off into assembly. On the front portion of the mantlet, all of the optic section as well as the coax holes were drilled out with the pin vise. These were molded hollow, or not necessarily hollow, but molded somewhat flat on the original kit tooling, and this was just addressed with the pin vise and the appropriate bits. Also in this section over here, the mantlet was a very smooth molding, just like the lower pan, and texturing was also added to this section. It's not really visible at this time, but you will notice it once it's painted, and the texturing was utilizing the same finger stipple technique, but instead of red putty, thick super glue was used in place. It's done in the same manner, but, you know, just a slightly different type of application. But once it's done, it'll yield for some excellent results once everything is fully painted, which you will see later on. Moving upward brings us to the cupola as well as the 2 hatches. The hatches in the cupola all have new handles added. The kit does have these details present, but they are integrally molded in a blade type format, much along the lines you see on Tamiya models. But, you know, one real quick modification you can do on any of these American tanks to bump up the detailing is to amputate the blade and just add a new handle. Normally this is done with fabricating the handle out of a bit of thin floor wire. However, I might as well take advantage of the parts rather than have them languish away in the spare bin, since I did have quite a number of those side handles left as spare. I just simply reutilize them on the various hatches. Once fitted into place, they blend in absolutely perfectly and are going to look great once everything is fully painted. And this leads us to the MG area, and this is a location that received a slight bit of modification compared to the kit original. So starting with the pintle mount itself, the pintle is supplied with the kit as well as the pintle mount. The pintle mount is a 2-piece assembly it's a little overly complex for what it is, but you know, it's perfectly fine. However, oddly enough, the base portion is completely vacant of any sort of details. And on the real units, these were actually hinged so they could flip down for transport use, and that bit of detailing is absent on the stock one. Stock one is okay at best, but it could definitely be improved. In its place, I utilized a ECA HD 3D printed pintle mount, and this is actually something that I just added to the 1/35 scale product line, where it's a number of these pintle mounts as well as also these travel locks. These ones here I just had left over from the M36 project, but I went ahead and made a dedicated runner just to these parts here, and they can be found on the ECA Shapeways store in the link listed below in the video description. As I often mention in these videos, whenever I design anything in 1/35 scale and smaller, those details are found on the Shapeways ECA store as opposed to just on the standard ECA catalog, which contains 1/6 and 1/16 scale detail parts. But regardless, these are there along with many of the other detail parts that I designed over time. Well, back to the component over here, it is it is printed hollow, so the kit MG can just drop directly into place, which is something I am going to recycle as the kit gun is excellent. But the mount also received some slight modification. One miss done on the Hobby Boss kit is that they give you the mount. The mount itself has more or less the correct shape, but it's in the wrong orientation. With the way the kit is designed, the piece is actually perpendicular to this, where this area is actually towards the front, and it plugs into two slots molded into the turret roof. The assembly is pretty easy and the holes line up, but on the real T29 series, it's actually the opposite. You can see how the channel section is on the side and this unit just sits on top. So to do this, the slots were plugged up with pieces of Plastruct strip, where I cut them to shape, glued them into the recesses, and I blended them in with the red putty. Very easily done. And then the kit mount was just repurposed. Luckily, with the way the piece is designed, it's pretty tall and it gives you more than enough surface area to file away the necessary material in order to get the piece to fit in place. In order to get it to fit in place, you need to file in two locations. First, you need to file in this type of an angle due to the angle here of the roof, but then you also have to angle it in this type of manner because the roof does have an upward slope. So it is a compound angle that you need to file into it. Easily done, just a few passes, test fit, rinse, wash, repeat until you have the part. Another thing I did was I rounded off the edges on the bracket. The bracket is squared off. On the real one, it's literally just a piece of stamped steel plate and it would be rounded. So that was added to this unit over here, giving you for the appearance that you do see. On the front one holds up the travel lock, and this was the kit original part. It was kept. I did round off the edges on it, and the original travel lock is just a very small little triangle that's molded in. It's missing any of the other detailing, so I simply snipped that off, polished it down, and I dropped on the ECA HD 3D printed one that you can see right here. Once this is painted and weathered, this would be a humongous focal point found on the roof of the turret. On the back, last thing I want to mention is with all of the various 50 cal storage racks and bits of equipment. This here is all kit supplied, nothing really much to go over there, but the only thing I did was I adjusted the geometry of these angle sections. On the kit, they are squared off, and on the real one, they are rounded. So on the bottom portion of the angle, I just hit it with a needle file, rounding it off to the appearance that you see here, and that's the last little tweak that was necessary in order to clean it up. Jumping back down to the suspension, I just want to mention that the suspension on this kit is a very detailed bit of equipment, and it is also very nicely engineered. The pieces do line up pretty well, and all the pieces are very nicely rendered. The one area that's a bit fiddly that the builder does have to pay attention to is with the shock absorbers. These are a multi-part assembly and need to be hinged in place in order to get the parts to fit on. Even though the suspension is not functional on this model over here, these pieces kind of have to free float in order to get everything fitted in place, and this can be a bit fiddly, so you do want to take your time and definitely stay on the ball with that. The pieces are molded, and of course they're molded, but there is a small little mold line found on these sections over here, so some sandpaper prior to the assembly is great to polish the little seam down, and it just makes the build go together a bit easier in that regard. On the front section over here is extremely nicely detailed, where everything needs to plug in, fit into place as a puzzle, and then if you go ahead and take your time with this, it will yield for some excellent results. And it's great to take advantage of that right now before the thing heads off into paint. And once painted, of course, here you get to see what it looks like fully assembled and fully completed. The row wheels and the other suspension components that I mentioned before went on pretty well, and the row wheels also go on very nicely. The pieces are nicely rendered out, so painting all the rubber tires on this is something that is fairly easily done. Although it is admittedly very tedious. In fact, just like with all vehicles of the Patton and Pershing family, there are a surprisingly large amount of rubber surfaces that need to be painted on the suspension. This is true for the main row wheels, but also the return rollers. Even though it looks pretty simple, there's a lot of little nooks and crannies on every little surface here, and this includes the intersection as well as the outer portions, and all these need to be painted for you to get the proper look. And you are going to be painting these parts with a fine paintbrush for a little while. Obviously, this vehicle containing more wheels than your standard Patton or Pershing pattern vehicle is going to take a slightly bit more time in order to do so. Fortunately, though, it's all worth it in the end because once the suspension goes on, it looks fantastic. Before I go to the sprocket, let's quickly leapfrog to the track. As I mentioned before, one of the more interesting aspects that this kit does have is that the kit does have workable track links, and this is something that's very noteworthy because generally when a kit is released, either the companies roll with a single piece vinyl, which I personally like, or they'll roll with a dreaded individual link and length, which is total garbage. And if it's the latter, generally you have to go ahead and track down an aftermarket source. But for the Hobby Boss kit here, that's just not the case. The kit does supply you with a set of excellent workable track links. As for the tracks themselves, they go together very, very well. I'm going to be editing that video shortly, and you'll see exactly how they go together. But as for paintwork, just like I always reference in these videos, the track found on these vehicles are a mosaic, and it's a combination of both steel and rubber. And when you're building and weathering and painting one of these things, you need to really know and understand this to better assist you with your weathering. Otherwise, you can run into a mistake, and this is something that a lot of people make out there because they're just not aware of the track composition that these things are made of, and they just, weather it with everything but rust or something along those lines, so it really helps to know. As for what the track materials are, well, this being a steel chevron version of the Pershing track, the outer portion is made out of steel, just like it would be on an HVSS Sherman. For the color, I went with, I believe it was NATO Black for the color, and NATO Black does a really good job with mimicking the parkerization or the oxide type coating that is found on these type of trackings, specifically when new. And then this is also true for the intersections as well, namely the duckbill portions. However, the portions where the tires actually roll, these are actually rubber, and you can see, or hopefully it comes out on camera, that the pieces are painted and weathered differently. This gives differentiation, and it actually shows a clear difference on the two materials, and again, this will actually help greatly your build in the end. You'll also notice that I did not add any sort of rusting effects to the tracks. Keep in mind these vehicles were still brand new, even during their testing phase, so the presence of rust on the tracks here is something that you really wouldn't get to see. And again, this is something that I generally mention in these videos. A lot of people out there, when they weather their tank tracks, they like to rust them up, and this is actually something that you wouldn't really see, specifically when the tanks are in theater, because they were still relatively really brand new. In some cases, they were brand spanking new. Rust is something that would develop on the tracks after a couple decades or so, so having a vehicle like this here, which for all intents and purposes would be fairly new, with rusty tracks, it's something that will probably hurt the look as opposed to helping it. So that's definitely something I want to mention. And that's where the good news about the tracks end. And there is a massive ding and asterisk on this kit in regards to the suspension, and no, it is not the track. It's actually the sprocket. You see, the sprockets on this model here actually have a really, really bad problem. A significant one, actually. One so bad that in some circumstances it might be the death nail to this build for many people out there. The sprocket, sadly, has an error, and it does not time with the track. And what timing is, this is if you're used to cog chains on motorcycles or bicycles or even engines for that matter, you'll know what I'm talking about. Timing is how the sprocket or the tooth ring interacts with the chain, or in this case, the track. And obviously it's very, very, very important. And sadly on this model here, it doesn't time well at all. In fact, it's arguably one of the worst kits that I've built in terms of, or I should say in regards of timing of the track. It is so serious that you'll be assembling the track, and when it comes time to wrap it around the sprocket, it's going to hang up, and if you try to brute force it, you're going to break your tracks, and it's just going to cascade into a world of crap. And that is definitely something you want to avoid. Unfortunately, you don't really have an option on here. If anyone out there is really good with 3D print, they could potentially address this and design a brand new sprocket to time with the Hobby Boss track. However, the kit standing, the sprockets are actually pretty bad in this regard, which is they basically have one job and they fail essentially at that one job. So if you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, oh no, all doom and gloom, rest assured it's not all that bad, because obviously I was able to build the tank, and yes, these are the kit supplied sprockets. In order to get the track to fit on the sprockets, I actually had to do a modification. It's one that you're actually never supposed to do, but in this situation here, there was no other alternative. I actually had to trim and modify the teeth, and this is something that has to be done by hand. And I actually show this in more depth in the track link tutorial video, and you'll see that in more depth when that video drops. But long story short, I had to go ahead and make the adjustments, and after I was able to do that, the track was able to more or less have the illusion of it timing around perfectly, giving you the look that you see here. Same is true for the sprocket on the reverse side, and this was literally the hardest aspect of the entire build, and it kind of sucked because it was really anticlimactic, because the kit itself is a complete slam dunk home run, and getting the sprockets off like this is a real kick in the shin of what would normally otherwise have been a flawless executed kit. But rest assured, I was still able to persevere. Is this something that would be a deal breaker for some people out there? Oh yeah, absolutely. I definitely would strongly not recommend this kit because of the sprockets, specifically if someone does not have the skill sets in order to hand fit them and tune them to the track. And so far as I know, like I said before, I'm unaware of any aftermarket solutions out there to remedy this issue. So this is something that may thwart some other people out there for getting this kit, rightfully so. It's definitely going to really ruin your time. Is this something that would be a deal breaker for me if I was to get another one? No, actually, I would actually get another one of these kits and build it with the side skirts, and I would have no problem with the sprockets because, again, I have the skill sets in how to deal with a situation like this. But again, this is the biggest red flag of the entire kit, and unfortunately it's an important one. Tank without the tracks are the most important focal point on a tank, and having it have a screw up like this, it's actually pretty substantial. So I'm pretty sure I basically killed this kit for many people out there if they were interested in it. But hey, that's why you tune in this channel, because you want to see my unbiased opinion. Is it something that can be fixed? Yes. Is it something that can be fixed by everybody? No. And is it something that's gonna really dissuade some people from buying this kit? Absolutely. But again, you know, that's what we have here. Moving from the tracks takes to the remainder of the details, if you're still interested to know, of course. The remainder of the details went on absolutely perfectly, no other problems to be mentioned. I basically went over everything earlier on before the model was finished, but here you have to see some other aspects of the build. So here we have the taillights. Like I mentioned before, they are very nicely rendered out, and I just simply painted them accordingly. The one here on the left-hand side is painted with the cat's eye in red, while the one on the reverse side, it's painted in gloss black. Of course, the blackout light, the rectangular part, is painted silver on both, as I always mention on these videos. On the front portion over here, let's see if the barrel gets in the way. All right. You can see the front detailing in better light. Here we have the bound 1919. I did drill that out with a pin vise, as you can see. Again, I always reference in these videos, if you do not have the tooling or the experience in this, don't do it. You can really screw it up and it'll actually hurt the look as opposed to help. But if you have the tooling and experience out there, drilling out barrels is something that always looks great. And the juice is always worth the squeeze, when done properly, of course. Here we have the bow headlights, everything is stock out of the box, as well as the brush guards. They went out without any hitches and came out to be perfect. Here we also have the spare tracks mounted in their track racks. The spare tracks are the kit supply ones. I just simply painted and weathered them, and they dropped into place. The one thing that I do want to reference was what I mentioned earlier in the video. The kit does have a small little quirk where the alignment of the forks over here isn't quite where it needs to be. So if you follow the kit and don't test fit these in place, you're going to come into a surprise when it comes time to fit on the spare links. Fortunately, it's something you want to adjust and adjust for, and if you do, the pieces work on, or they mount onto the model flawlessly if you just take your time and you make sure the parts are in the appropriate locations. And appropriate locations, I'm not referring to where the kit suggestion points are. This is something you are going to have to glue one in place that's kit supplied, namely the ones here on the inner, and then the outer ones here you basically just adjust with the piece in hand. You mount it on the part temporarily, and you just test fit it, and you mark it and glue it on accordingly. That's the best way to install these without there being any sort of hidden surprises. Moving upward takes to the siren. I already referenced that before, but now you get to see what it looks like with that wire detailing fully painted, and it always helps look at the build, and it's an easy way to enhance the build and give it a little bit more extra realism. Also on that note, you can see the torsion bars that I mentioned before. Fit in place, it really does complete the look of the model. Carrying on further, takes to the side tin work over here, where you can see the little grab handles. Like I stated before, these were probably, outside of the track, one of the more difficult aspects of the build, just because of how frail and small everything is molded and how precise the installation has to be. But as you can see, if you take your time and if you have a steady hand and a little bit of patience, you could easily assemble one of these parts and everything just fleshes out accordingly. Same is true also for the units on the reverse side. Only on the reverse side, you can also see this is the location of the Pioneer tools. These are, again, the kit supply ones, painted off the model, and were just mounted accordingly. For the paint work, for this one here, I rendered the Pioneer tools with the units being painted in olive green or olive drab. This is something that's not uncommonly seen on US AFV from the World War II time frame all the way up till today. You do have an option out there on how to paint the tools. I've referenced this in a few videos. You can go with either a green method like this, or you can also roll with the pieces with their wood exposed. This is just left up to discretion of the builder. I like to mix it up a bit on my builds just so it adds some variation to the collection, but this is something that you definitely may want to consider. The other thing you want to keep aware of are the tie-down straps. This is something that a lot of people out there forget, and on an American tank like this, the straps would be a webbing type material, and the webbing is integrally molded onto the tools on their tool post. So what I did was I simply just painted it with a swipe of Tamiya khaki, leaving for the results that you see here. On the tools themselves, I weathered the handles with a little bit of white just to give that distressed and the worn look, which is commonly seen on these types of equipment. And well, I should say the end result really speaks for itself, and it really does complement the look very well. As I mentioned before, also you see all those little annoying little handles over there, and miraculously they survived the build. So something like this is not uncommon for something to get snagged and pop off on you, so you want to be careful when you're building and handling one of these models, either in a build form or even in a construction format. They love to snag stuff. On the tail section here, this brings us to the exhaust manifolds. Stock out of the box, just simple seam work was used to clean them up, and then they were just painted and weathered to the format that you see here. Same weathering technique that I utilize on all of my builds. For the rust is sophisticated finishes rusting agent. You brush on the material, put on a activator, and it actually grows real rust onto the exhaust manifolds. Then a little bit of airbrush with Tamiya flat black on the exhaust tips for good measure. On the back here, you can see the travel lock. It is non-functional on this model. It can only be rendered in the retracted state like you see here. So if you want to render this piece with the barrel travel lock, you are going to have to do some modifications to the model. It's not impossible, but it's not something, or I should say it's something that's out of the scope of this video. Moving up to the engine deck, and as I mentioned before, the engine deck on this kit is excellent, very nicely detailed, and it's actually one of the kit's high points. Here you also get to see all of the little fuel and filler caps for the other fluids. The fuel caps right here and here have their sweaty weathering done to them, as I always reference in these videos. The large one here would be for the radiator, so that would be water or some kind of an antifreeze type material, so you're not really going to get the sweaty type effects. And the one here in the back would actually, if I'm not mistaken, be for transmission fluid, so there is some sweat going on over here, as you can see, because that stuff loves to run on you. So there you go. And that brings us now to the turret. On the turret itself, I already went over all the features earlier in the video, so there's no point now beating a dead horse. However, now that it's fully complete, you really get to appreciate all of those features that I referenced earlier. On the mantlet itself, I did add a type of casting agent or to enhance the cast texturing further from the kit original. This was a brush-on type material, so the texturing is a bit finer compared to the steppling technique that I referenced earlier for the bottom portion of the turret. And this is something that works great because you can have different grades of textures on your model, and it just helps the build overall. Also, depending on the location, like this one here, it does have some nice little details molded on. It's better to go with a brush-on type texture as opposed to a stipple texture, just because you have more precision with the brush-on method. Once everything is painted and weathered, though, it definitely looks the part, and it always helps the build overall. On the lower portion of the turret here, you can see the texturing blended into the side portion, and it looks fantastic. It really just makes the turret look like it's a single piece, which is, again, true to form to the real one. On the top portion of the turret, you can see the MP65 antenna bases fitted in place. The kit originally does supply you with antenna bases, however, they're rather amorphous and very, very simplistic in detailing. So rather than using the kit ones, I swapped those out with these resin MP65s that I have here. These ones I've referenced a few times in several of my build videos, and what they are, they're actually resin copies of the Tamiya MP65 antenna bases that come with, oddly enough, the 1/35 scale old school Walker Bulldog. For as old as that kit is, oddly enough, the MP65s are excellent. They're probably some of the best ones in 1/35 scale, which is amazing considering the age of that kit. But here you get to see them mounted on this modern era super kit, and they definitely enhance it. When you're painting an MP65, keep this in mind. The part that looks like the things that you see for Honey, the rib section, those are red ceramic on the real unit. So on my models here, I always paint them with Tamiya Hull Red, and then a swipe of clear gloss is added to give you that glazed sheen. Antenna bases is always probably the easiest way to give an extra little bit of color pop and intrigue to your US tank, and it's something that almost everybody out there misses. Don't be an idiot, paint your damn insulators. I can't recommend that enough. Aside from the ceramic portion, the MP65, this middle section here is actually rubber and it's really flexible on the real one. So in this one here, it's just painted with flat black. And then the top portion where the wire would actually plug into is painted in olive drab, as I've seen on several real examples. Once everything's painted like this here, you can see just how much life it gives the model. Also, you see on this one, I do not have any wires hooked up to the MP65. That's okay with how thin these pieces are casted. Trying to add wire to them is very problematic, but like I always mention in these videos, you can have them wireless as the wire on the real unit just plugs on. So something that can plug on and plug off, so you don't necessarily have to have it on your build for it to still be accurate. Moving forward, takes to the Commander's cupola. Like I stated before, it's an excellent bit of tooling out of the box, with the exception of the addition of the plastic handle that I mentioned before. Of course, the periscopes are painted in gloss black, as I always reference in these videos, and all of the open periscopes are painted as such, including the optic that we have here on the front for the gunner. This now takes us to the M2HB. So this is the kit supplied M2HB, and like I stated before, it is actually excellent. The detailing on it is awesome. Built it out of the box and just painted and weathered it accordingly. The grips have been painted with red Bakelite. As I always mention in these videos, they just look awesome on 50 cals. If you go with the red Bakelite, you can also go with black Bakelite as well. It just depends on really the choice, the personal preference of the builder. I like to roll with red just to give a little extra color pop to the model. The kit does supply you with the decal here for the ammunition can labeling, which is excellent. Nice little bit of detailing. It's not found on all kits, so that the fact they give you that is a nice touch. They also correctly rendered the World War II pattern of ammo can, and you just simply paint and weather it accordingly. As I mentioned before, the pintle mount is the 3D printed one. And as you can see, it really looks good, and it really complements this piece immensely, along with the retracted travel lock right over there. It just gives so much more added life to the build as opposed to just using the stock one. Can you use the stock one? Yeah, sure, it's perfectly fine, but this one here definitely does look better. Moving forward to the main armament, as you can see, totally seamless. The seams were blended away perfectly, which was aided with the primer coat that I mentioned before. It did its job, and there were no hidden surprises that needed to be mentioned. The seam work was very easily contended with. Just some thick super glue, some fine sandpaper, and just a little bit of elbow grease was all that was required to polish this bad boy down. Of course, the one area you want to make, or I should say be careful with, is the muzzle section, as it does have the most amount of detailing and geometry on this piece over here. So you will just want to take your time and carefully sand and polish the part with a little bit of caution. You do that, and the piece should work out perfectly fine. It's a very simple type seam to remove. It's nothing like we see on, say, a Leopard one or an Israeli tank where you have lots of little straps and buckles holding the thing down. Those are definitely probably the final boss of seam removals on armament barrels. But for this one here, it was a breeze, and it went by very, very quickly. Also, what I mentioned before with the mantled, why you want to paint the inner recess, as you can see, everything has been painted. There's no hidden surprises of any missed locations of paint, and this is again something I highly recommend, not just on this build, but many other builds out there that are similar to this. It's always good to have some base coat in those sections over there, as well as primer, just to make sure you cover your bases. And that's all there is to mention about the detailing. This takes us directly to the paint and the markings. So for the model's paintwork, this is painted with my standard US World War II shade of olive drab. This is the same color that you've seen on a multitude of my builds, from small scale stuff being a 172 all the way up to my 1/6 scale models. This is the exact same paint. The paint itself is exterior latex house paint that is, again, mixed to a custom shade that I developed about 10 years ago now. 2010 was actually when I cobbled this stuff together, and I've been utilizing it ever since because, well, it looks good. The paint is applied via the airbrush. Of course, before you can apply the paint, the model is thoroughly primed with flat black spray paint, and then after the flat black is dried, the base coat gets applied with the airbrush, and then from there it progresses with its weathering. For the weathering, it's a mixture of both airbrush and dry brushing. The airbrushing is used for the fading effects as well as also the counter shading effects, and then the dry brushing is used for the distressed edges and paint chip effects that you see here, which is typically seen on all of my builds. To me, a panel line accent was also greatly used to effect on several of the locations, namely the well beads, also the grill work. To me, a panel line accent loves grill work like this here, as well as also things like embossed and crevices and row wheel crevices. It just loves that stuff, and the model always looks excellent after the stuff is applied. For the decals or the markings, you'll see that it's very sparse. There are no stars or anything like that, and literally all the markings that you see on this model were the ones that were supplied with the kit, which gives us both the name of the vehicle as well as the date, which I'm not sure if it would get that in real life. If I'm not mistaken, I believe these were added to the vehicles when they were put on display outside of the Patton Museum in Fort Knox, Kentucky, where they were for the longest period of time before being moved down to Fort Benning in Georgia. And as well as I believe these type of markings are also found in several of the other vehicles similar to this that for the longest time were floating around several of the military bases and museums out there. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think Fort Jackson, South Carolina, has or had one of these vehicles on display as well. I remember seeing in this Google Earth satellite view, but as well as a nice looking M4A3 E8 Sherman. But back to this model. So what you see is what you get. If you are building one of these models and want to have some more markings on it, that would be pretty rad. It would be awesome with a star right over here. It's just beckoning for one. But if you're going to do that, you might have to dig into your spare decal bin, see if you have something on stock, or perhaps pick up a aftermarket decal set of one flavor or another. It would definitely help on something like this. For this build here, though, I just went with the out of the box offerings, and this is the final outcome that you get. Fortunately, the decal quality is excellent, as you can see. They went out without any sort of problems, and then you guessed it, the entire model was coated with a layer of VMS matte varnish. I always mention the VMS matte varnish because I absolutely love this stuff. I cannot recommend it enough, specifically if you've done models for a while and decals were always something that have been probably an Achilles heel for you. The VMS matte varnish is definitely something I cannot recommend enough. And it leaves for excellent results either with or without markings. And this one here, even though it has sparse markings, the decals did come out quite well. As I mentioned before, the T29 and the subsequent vehicles in the same family are essentially nothing more than roided up Pershings and M46 patents. And to put things into perspective, here I have my 1/35th scale M46. This, by the way, is a Dragon M46 in 1/35th scale. It's the subject matter of its very own model showcase video. And it's an excellent kit. I absolutely love it. And I definitely recommend it. But here you get to see it compared side by side with its bigger roided up brother. So here we have the M46 right over here. And as you can see, it is basically dwarfed by the T29 in just about every single metric. And the M46 is not exactly a tiny tank, but next to this thing here, it definitely makes it look travel size. Also, with looking at the two side by side, you really get to see and appreciate how the designers basically took what they knew and just merely scaled it up in order to create the larger counterpart. But at the end of the day, it really is nothing more than just a roided up Pershing and Patton. In the end, I had an absolute blast with working on this one. The T29 series was one of those vehicle types that have always been on my wish and to-do list, and to finally have one in the collection, it's a feeling that just feels really, really great. I love this vehicle, and I always love the vehicle type, so to finally have one, you can imagine there's a bit of accomplishment there. Which is the perfect point to pivot us into skill level and recommendations. So I'm just going to come out and say it. If you are a fan of the T29 series, you played in the video games, you just really, really dig it, and you just want to have a model in your collection, and if you never touched a model kit before, or you're a beginner builder, then this is most certainly, definitely, absolutely not going to be the kit for you. And that is definitely something that you can take to the bank. Although the kit is relatively simple, it is not something for a beginner at all. Just the suspension alone is something that's going to give a beginner a really tough run for their money. And then when you get to the workable track and then the sprocket, forget it. It's just not going to be in the cards for you. If you've never touched a plastic model kit before, this is certainly not the place to start. In my opinion, this here is a solid mid-tier kit. This is the type of kit where I recommend to someone who has all of the following techniques lined up and locked down. These would be things like hand fitting, working with small sub-assemblies, as well as also with working with fine detail components. If you know how to properly deburr and work with fine, small, fiddly bits, then this kit here is something that opens up to something I would recommend for you. Unlike some other kits out there that are a little bit more challenging, where you have things like photo etch and other metal components to contend with, this one here, it's just your standard injection plastic molded plastic model kit. And because of that, it is, again, something that is a solid mid-level builder. If you are an advanced builder, obviously this kit I could recommend to you all day long. The kit goes together very, very, very well. It is decently engineered in that respect. The biggest hurdle and the biggest kneecapping ding that this kit does have is the sprocket. For some reason, I don't know how they were able to get that amiss and have that enter production in that format, but that is truly the biggest hurdle that this kit does have. If you have the techniques to work around said sprocket issue, then this kit then becomes an absolute breeze, if not an absolute blast to work on. I really enjoyed it very, very much. Yes, I would build another one. Yes, I probably would get and build another one, only build it with the side skirts this time around, and it's definitely something I have absolutely no reservations with. So that basically tells you just how much I really did enjoy this build. The build is very nicely detailed. It has the nice details that are integrally molded on that I referenced before. And overall, the subject matter, it's just Really, really cool. I'm pretty sure you're going to be asking, watching this, well, John, how does this compare to the competitive option being from TACCOM? And unfortunately, at this time, I can't really answer that question because I've yet to build any of the TACCOM T29 series of vehicles. They are on my to-do list. At some point in time, I will eventually get all of them and do a proper model showcase video on each, but for the time being, we're just going to have to put a pin in that. As specifically for the Hobby Boss one, fear not, the kit actually is very, very nice and builds very well. ... if you could get past the damn sprockets. Get past those sprockets and the build itself becomes basically a teddy bear. If someone is an advanced builder and are looking for other ways to improve upon this kit, there are a few options that are available. Although, admittedly, the kit itself is pretty much solid out of the box. But as we saw in this video, the MG mounts could use a bit of an upgrade, as well as the antenna bases. Those are really the two biggest things that I've seen. But because this vehicle here is essentially nothing more than a roided up Pershing, basically anything that's out there on the market for the Pershing can be used on this build. Such examples would be aftermarket suspension pieces, aftermarket tracks, aftermarket detail fittings like headlights, MGs, things along those lines. All of those would be something that you can add to one of these models to further improve upon it. Is it something that's worth it? As I generally mention in these videos, that's best up to the discretion of the builder. In my opinion, it's really a solid kit from the get-go, with the few exceptions that I did reference in this video. But outside of that, basically what you build is what you get with the box. Does it open up some room for improvement? Sure. But again, is it worth it? That's really up to the discretion of the individual who is building it. Last and absolutely certainly not least, this brings us to recommendations. So straight from the gate, if you are into American tanks, this kit here is beyond recommended. If you are a fan of the Pershing and Patton family of vehicles, this kit is, you guessed it, absolutely recommended. If you are a fan of World War II American tanks, post-World War II American tanks, Cold War American tanks, or just World War II and Cold War tanks in general, this kit here is also an absolute no-brainer to add to your collection. I would also easily recommend this kit for anyone who builds and has a collection of the other super heavy tanks from around the same time frame. If you're the type of guy that's got the Moss, the E100, the T28, or even the Object 279 Troyanov, this kit here is also a definite no-brainer for you. On a similar note, if you have the American T28, the M103, the T29 here, as well as its subsequent variants, would also greatly be a nice addition to your collection, because you could really just fill in the gaps in between the T28 and the M103 heavy tank. And needless to say, you could really see, if you get a bunch of those kits and line them up, you can see the course of evolution from this vehicle here all the way up to the final end result, which was indeed the M103. As I often mention in these videos, pretty much every tank kit out there can be used in a diorama setting. However, because of the size and the weird and interesting subject matter that this kit does represent, this does lend itself to something that perhaps might be really cool for a diorama setting of one flavor or another. Because of the vehicle's workable track links, you can possibly work that into the setting in one type of flavor or another, and of course that's something that's best left up to the creativity of that person in mind. Either way, this kit here, no matter how you slice it, is an awesome kit, and it's one that would greatly help just about any collection that is out there. I know my collection, personally, is greatly improved with the addition of this model here added to the ranks. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale American T29 heavy tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/35th scale model showcase videos like the one that you just watched, to my other 1/6 scale project update videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.